to one of my favorite speakers, Doug Long. Doug doesn't need a whole lot of introduction because those of you who are involved with the pharma industry know him well. He is, I guess you keep going through mergers, so I keep having to change your email address, right? And getting bigger, but his firm is really the premier firm with regard to having proprietary data on what's happening and where and why, and then trying to explain it to the people in the industry. And Doug, I don't think there's anyone I've seen speak who does a better job of explaining exactly what's going on the market side in terms of what drugs are doing well and not doing well and what the trends are. So please join me in welcoming Doug Long of IQVIA.
Thank you, Peter. Fred mentioned Keytruda that came with the Organon deal. Probably the best deal was Abbott buying Knoll Pharmaceuticals, and they got this little product called Humira.
Sorry, the camera can't move.
So I got a lot of slides, 75 slides, 45 minutes. So we better get started. So how can you start a presentation out with COVID-19 and the flu? Basically, sorry.
Is there any way you could make the screen larger, the projection?
That's about my big. I like it larger too because I can't see it. Any rate, I'm going to make sure that you get copies of this.
Yeah.
So COVID right now looks like it's in the rearview mirror. And partly you're not seeing anywhere near the uptake of COVID vaccines. There's been a big push on, but few people are actually taking those. The good news, the deaths are down, and you can see on the right-hand side, these are the tests, and you see that the biggest ones were 2021, 2022, and then you got 23, 20, 22, 23. And so we're going down. So I'm not expecting that you're going to see a big increase in COVID tests. Partly, I think, is because the variant moves so quickly. And what are you getting vaccinated for or boosted for? You getting the current variant or not? That's the big challenge. The next thing, we go to the next slide, is the flu vaccine season, and that looks like it's been fairly strong, pretty consistent. You see, during COVID, everybody got their flu shots, and we kind of predicted this because we look at the Australian flu season, and it's a good proxy of what ours can look like, and they had kind of an average flu season. What you don't see on this chart, or you can't hardly see it, is that we've had big flu seasons before. I think the biggest one was 17 and 18. So there's been big flu seasons before. Next slide. So I want to look at some what I call market trends, medical claims and activity. Next slide. So we put together a healthcare index for COVID. So that was indexed at 100% the first 8 weeks of 2020. This chart looks at where we are at the fourth quarter of 2022. So we're back to 100. So we're back to 100, back to where we started from. However, what was really up was office visits, telehealth visits, and hospital visits. Also, new prescriptions were up. What was down, elective procedures, they've been down consistently. They're indexed at 98, but what's most disturbing to me was the screenings, 89. And that's the mammograms, the PSA tests, and so forth. That is a big concern, and I think we'll pay the price for it later on going on. So a big concern of mine. The next slide kind of takes us fast forward the elective procedures polled, and I would call COVID the death of the susceptible. It killed more than 1 million people in the United States, most of them 65 and over, most of them with multiple chronic conditions. So those people are no longer with us, and so they might be the ones that are going in for elective procedures. So that might be one of the reasons why elective procedures are down. Screening's a little bit more of concern. Now, in-person visits that plateaued, telehealth, let me just talk a little bit about that. At one point in the spring of 2020, it was about 20% of all the medical claims came from telehealth. Now it's down to about 5. And it really depends on what disease state that you're talking about. ADHD was a big one for telehealth. And there's some people that thought the prescribing rigor was not very sufficient. So they actually pulled back. CVS and Walmart pulled back for a couple of these telehealth on ADHDs. Lab tests are lower. That's concerning to me. And this is the same time that we now have a test that you can test 30 different types of cancer through blood. So we should be going in a different direction or a better direction. That's not happening. Next slide. In our use of medicines report that we do every April, we picked out 6 things that were kind of interesting. The first one is antibiotic use and rising antimicrobial resistance. Now, some of that came from hand washing. You remember back in the day, people hand washing or hand sanitizing, they're bringing their groceries into the garage and sanitizing them there before they were bringing them into the house. And everybody was hand washing. And Dr. Mark McCary from Johns Hopkins said, what are we hand washing for? Because it's very aerosolly, not through touch. So you see that antibiotic days of therapy is down, but its use is up in children and adults. ADHD grew 11% of the last 5 years to 38 billion days of therapy, and in 2022. So we do see some shortages on that because of the over demand. And what's interesting is women 20 to 64 were the leading cause of why ADHD prescriptions went up. When I first looked at the numbers, I said it's got to be the kids. It's got to be the kids. It actually was women 20 to 64, particularly 20 to 40. They're probably working from home with the kids at home, and they needed a little extra help. Mental health in young people. And I think this is my personal opinion, it's a direct result of social media, because you see that mental health prescriptions for girls under 19 up 33% over the last couple of years, 33%. So big concern. The next slide is we're going to talk about this greatly, and Peter talked about GLP-1s. And you have a rising use of novel obesity drugs, and the Lilly version of Mounjaro for diabetes, for weight loss, was just approved yesterday. And so you'll see now you'll have Wegovy and that new drug. Then you have the combat in the opioid overdose epidemic. And that is not prescription drugs. It's fentanyl and methamphetamine. And it's probably because the open border we have from the south comes across the open border, and this is killing a number of young people. And then contraceptive use is kind of interesting. It's been down for the last 5 years, particularly the long acting and so forth. So I don't know exactly what that means, but it's an interesting take. So those were the 6 things. Next slide. When you look at what can contribute most, and these are looking at specialty drugs. Now, so the big 3 are immunology, oncology, and diabetes. We don't refer to diabetes, the GLP-1s, as a specialty class. They're a traditional class. So that's why the numbers look a little bit funky, because that class is growing so quickly. So immunology, oncology, diabetes, and you see a little bit on HIV, a lot of all others, and the all others might pick up the rare and orphan disease drugs, cell and gene therapies, and things of that sort. Next slide. So we're back to kind of where we were before in terms of growth. You know, that we had a big increase in COVID vaccinations that increased the marketplace. Now we're kind of back to, kind of more of a normal state. Next slide. When you look at these are the top, let's skip this because we already covered it. Prescriptions are up. Is that there's more than almost 7 billion prescriptions out there right now, retail, mail, and long-term care. And we look at this 2 ways: adjusted prescriptions and unadjusted prescriptions. The adjusted prescription takes a 90-day prescription, breaks it into 3 30-day prescriptions. So both are up, and you can see that unadjusted is that the COVID vaccines had a big impact on unadjusted prescriptions, and because they were traditional medicines, and they're not 90-day prescriptions. Next slide. Where are we now? So this is looking at dollar growth in the marketplace. Total market is up. Retail mail is up. Retail mail prospered more from COVID than did non-retail. If you look at the non-retail numbers, you see the big decline in terms of growth we saw in 2020. And that's finally started to come back. Now, when we go to the next slide, we break out the non-retail into clinics, hospitals, home health, and long-term care. First, I want to talk about clinics. Clinics are doing fine. Second thing is hospitals has been a bumpy road, and a lot of that has to do with one product, the Veklury, which was an antiviral for COVID. It reached about $4 billion worth of sales. Now it's about a quarter of that because people are not in the hospitals for COVID. So not needing to use that drug. So that's why it looks bumpy. Long-term care has recovered. It bore the brunt of mortality. More people died in long-term care facilities. Particularly, this was kind of ground zero of that in New York. And actually, so many people died in New York, they lost a congressional seat in the last census, believe it or not. So long-term care has recovered, and there's a relationship between home health care and long-term care because you're faced with putting a loved one in a long-term care facility in 2020, you probably chose to treat them at home, not to bear the risk of putting them in a long-term care facility. Now, just a note on the retail classes is that food stores has grown the most, but you see a increase in chain and mass, increase in independence. But a little later on, when I talk about GLP-1s, you'll see some interesting dynamics going on in those classes. Next slide. This is specialty versus traditional. Remember, I said that diabetes is not a specialty class; it's a traditional class. So if you looked at, you saw that acceleration in growth. It was particularly coming from specialty. And specialty got up to 51.1% of the market. Now it's down to 50.7%. And it could be next year it's lower than 50 because that's the growth of the whole GLP-1 category, which I'll share with you in a few minutes. Next slide. So when you're talking about specialty, you really need to think about what class you're in. So the biggest class in retail for specialty is the HIV. The biggest class for male is immunology. The biggest class for the non-retail is oncology. That's the hospitals and clinics and so forth. But immunology is second in retail, oncology is fourth. That's the small molecules that go through primarily the retailers. Oncology is second in male, followed by multiple sclerosis. But you see the multiple sclerosis numbers are on a dollar basis are down. That means there's been genericization of some multiple sclerosis products and not a lot of innovation in the space. Next slide. 10 therapy areas dominate the market: immunology, oncology, HIV, and so forth. And you see that again in red, multiple sclerosis and all the respiratory are down, but the other ones are showing growth not only on a percent basis, but an absolute growth basis. Next slide. This is viral hepatitis, and I'm going to share with you a slide a little later because there was a new study that came out on viral hepatitis that we've only treated about 1/3 of the people, only cured about potentially 1/3 of the people we could have cured. And I'll explain why that is. These are the products. So Fred talked about Keytruda. So Keytruda is the biggest non-retail product, followed by Opdivo, Ocrevus, Derilex, Faspro, and so forth. And almost all of these are showing tremendous growth in the marketplace. The next slide looks at male. So there it's number one is Humira. We know that at the beginning of this year, we had two products, biosimilars for Humira, one high cost, high rebate from Amgen, one low cost, low rebate from Amgen. And we've had 6 or 7 others since then. And I have a chart on this of what's exactly happened on biosimilar input or uptake in Humira, Zipel, which is kind of surprising and actually very concerning. This is the specialty retail market. You see Biktarvy, Humira, Descovy, so a lot of the HIV products there. Let's move to the next one, GLP-1s. That's what I've been talking the most about. And so Mr. Stein talked a little bit about this, is how changing this potentially is that you now have 70% of the United States is obese or overweight, and 50% of the world is obese or overweight. And we know that obesity leads to less life, 10 years less life, possibly in cardiovascular, cholesterol, and so forth. So the big experiment to see is the next 5 years, as more people are on these drugs, do we see a correspondingly decline in cardiovascular drugs and cholesterol drugs? That's what we'll have to see. So Mounjaro, this is now called preventative care. You know, it's trying to, get to the cause of it. And as I said yesterday, Mounjaro now has a new form just for weight reduction. Next slide. And so this is, I know it's an eye chart, but this, when you look at it, this is a game changer. And it's probably maybe the second biggest game changer that I've seen. Well, let's put game changers. Immuno-oncology drug, game changer. The Humira was a game changer. These GLP-1s are game changer, and the HIV drugs were game changers, and Hep C, as the game changer. So this has got a lot of both preventive, and also a lot of other ways that where the patients are. Next slide. So Mounjaro from Lilly, which came out in 2022, late, had the second biggest launch trajectory from Harvoni, was #1. So remember when we were talking about Harvoni, what a tsunami that was? Is that these GLP-1s are a tsunami. Next slide. So here's Hep C. So I'm going to use the Hep C as an example. So this Hep C is that 1/3 of the people that are eligible for these drugs to be cures, and this is cure. And it may be because it's the patient population, which is a lot of them are incarcerated, and a lot of them are drug users. Very hard to, well, the incarcerated patients should be easy to treat because you know where they are. And you need a couple tests to be able to diagnose it and get them on their drugs. And you could force them to take it for 8 weeks because you have to take it for 8 weeks for it to work. There's 3 million people in the United States that have chronic HCV. We know that it's caused by drug use primarily. And these treatments are very effective. They cure 95% of the patients, but they're relatively expensive, $20,000 to $25,000. But put that in context with what we pay for some cancer drugs and some other things. Next slide. Skip this. In essence, time. Let's move forward. This is the obesity map in the United States from 2011 to 2022. The browner it is, the more obese it is. And there just looks like two places that, California being one of them, maybe because they have more sunshine there or what have you. But the rest of the country's got more obese. Next slide. So when we talk about the GLP-1s, we're talking about Ozempic. We're talking about Trulicity. We're talking about Mounjaro. We're talking about Rybelsus, Wegovy, all others. Now, Ozempic and Rybelsus and Wegovy are the same molecule. One's a pill form, one's for weight loss, and one's for for diabetes. But there's a lot of off-label use for weight loss. And then Mounjaro and the new one that just came out, just approved yesterday. So this is the one that's growing. Now let's move to the next slide. This is the money slide. So in 2018, is that this market was about $9 billion. In 2022, it was $35 billion. In 2023, our estimate is going to be $61 billion. So think about that. It's gone from 9 billion to 61 billion in the span of 5 years. And it really depends on where you're focused, is that about 2/3 of all the retail growth is coming from GLP-1s, one class, little less in non-retail and mail. So it's retail is where most of these prescriptions are filled. Now, what you might not know is every retailer in America loses money on every GLP-1 prescription they dispense, every one. Some people told me they're losing $1 million a month on dispensing these GLP-1s. Some independents have refused to dispense them, and they're sending their business to the chain pharmacy, which I don't think is a very good long-term strategy. So there's a lot of stress on GLP-1s that something's got to give, and it's a highly discounted category. But basically, they buy the product for $1,000 and they get reimbursed $920. So they lose about $80 on each prescription. Next slide. Opioids and amphetamines. We said the peak of the opioid epidemic was 2011. And we look at this on a morphine milligram equivalence. Since that time, is that the use of opioids is down 64%. And we're down to the levels that we saw back in the year 2000s, before OxyContin probably got hit its stride. Now, I'm going to cover the right-hand slide in a second, but in a better way. Let's move to the next slide. So this is the leading causes of overdose deaths. And you see the second column from the right, which is fentanyl. And you see that category is almost up 1,000% in opioid deaths in the last overdose deaths in the last 5 years. That's followed by the stimulants, which is methamphetamine. That's also followed by cocaine. Interesting enough, heroin, there's not a lot of heroin overdoses right now, maybe because it's more expensive. And then the prescription opioid numbers are going down, and they only represent about 11% of the overdose deaths. And 5 years ago, they were 1/4. So that problem has largely been solved, in my opinion. Next slide. So the overdose deaths have kind of plateaued, and there was a big increase in overdose deaths because of COVID. Not only that, big increase in suicide in COVID. So you think about the drug use and the mental health issues exacerbated by COVID. So this total overdose deaths in the next slide is the prescription opioids. And you see that they're at historically low numbers, lower than they've been since 2015. So every state has a prescription drug program for opioids. I don't see states having a fentanyl program. I don't see states having a methamphetamine program. Those are the things that are killing our Americans. Next slide. Generics and biosimilars. Generics, as Peter mentioned, have no problem in terms of selling merchandise. Prescriptions look good. They're up on an adjusted basis. They're up on an unadjusted basis. Their dollars have been relatively flat, and they actually represent less dollars in the marketplace consistently than they did since 2017. Next slide. And you have generic price erosion. And be a little more specific, but just think for a minute, is you had a $100 product became a $10 generic product. And now you have 3 buyers that control 91% of all the generic purchasing. You have a very prolific FDA Office of Generic Drugs that approve all these ANDAs. And only 10% of what they approve is new stuff. 90% they've already approved something. So you might have 10, 15, 20 players in a molecule when there's only room for 5. So price deflation, and then you have more players. Peter mentioned the Asian players. It's more the Indian players, because you've been really seeing a big, lot less China activity in the United States after COVID. Next slide. So I mentioned, you had a $100 product became a $10 product. Since that time, the top 20 molecules have declined 20%. And if you take the 2 outliers out, they're down 25%. So I say, when is enough enough? Is that I describe the generic business, I've described it for the last 5 years, as a race to the bottom. And nobody wants to invest in it anymore. So let's move to the next slide. Put this in perspective. There's 2 products now. That's Ozempic and Humira are bigger than the whole generic business. 2 products. 2 products, and that's 2 molecules versus 1,000 87 molecules. 2 molecules are bigger than 1,100 molecules. It used to be 4 products, then it was 8 products. At this rate, maybe with Ozempic, it might be 1 product. So something's got to give. Now, next slide. So the problem is not they're 87% of the prescriptions, and they only represent 9% of the dollars. So this kind of, we had the 80-20 rule. This is now the kind of new version of the 90-10 rule. And I'd suggest that 10 is way too low. Next slide. So, I mentioned the ANDAs. So ANDA is an abbreviated new drug application that you see back in the numbers. This is injectables, other forms in total. Back in the day, in the early 2000s, early 2010s, is about 2/3 of the products that got approved launched. Last year, it was less than 50%, and this year through June, it's less than 20%. So think about you spent all this money to bring a ANDA through approval, and there's no commercial return on that. Next slide. This just talks about there's more players than ever before. Some really don't have an idea of their bottom line, so they're coming at selling at cost or maybe lower than cost. And the best example I can give you, you've heard cisplatin and carboplatin. Shortages on that. Everybody hear that before? One product or one manufacturer represented 50% of those sales. They got inspected finally in India. They failed the inspection, so all of a sudden 50% was off the market. The FDA goes to the other players in the market, said, "Well, would you supply the market with the cost that Intas was selling it for?" And they said no, because they would lose money. So then FDA went to China to see if they could get that product from China. So there's more players, the more fragmentation. Remember that back in the day it was Teva and Mylan. It's a lot more fragmented than before. Next slide. Just to Peter's point, a lot of activity on biosimilars. Let's go to the next slide. There's a lot being worked on. And these are the products you see that how long they've been out in the market. Somatropin, which was a human growth hormone, was the first one, and the latest one has been Humira. 6 or 7 or 8 have launched, and I'll show you a slide on that in a minute. And we just published a paper. You can go ahead. We just published a paper on the biosimilar void. And about 50% of the biosimilars have no competitors. 50% of the biologics have no biosimilar competitors. Which is, if we're looking at biosimilars, they're supposed to save costs. We need them to save costs like the generics did, because generics are running out of steam. Next slide. There's an advantage if you're first or second. In the biosimilars, they tend to have the higher share. And then I think the next slide is the opportunity is there. We see Humira now and Stelara next year. So 2 of the biggest autoimmune drugs will face biosimilar competition. The next slide is any rate. So maybe I put this in a different spot. I want to show you what's happened to Humira so far. Drug shortages. There's more drug shortages than ever before. This is the FDA numbers, and this is for fiscal year 2023, which is through September. And my suggestion is that the supply chain is more fragile than it's ever been, partly because of increased demand on some products. GLP-1s, for example, there's a big shortage on GLP-1s for the initial doses. So it's very hard to get. ADHD drugs is another one. And then you have inspections that are causing some of these shortages. Now, the next slide looks at where they are. And you see oncology, pediatric oncology, psychiatric products. So they're everywhere in the marketplace. So this is a big problem. Now, why the problem? Let's look at the next slide. Is that There are large, they're increasing, and few are being resolved. Second is that some of the impact is driven by injectable shortages driven by demand. Talked about the GLP-1s on that. And then you have, if you have some buyers like the hospital GPOs are very good at when they hear there's potential shortage, they buy it up. So they protect themselves. You had the plant in Wilson, North Carolina, the Pfizer plant got hit by a tornado that took out some injectable space. And there are more shortages in generics and injectables, but there's also brand and shortages and due to demand. Next slide. This is a very disconcerting chart to me. This looks at FDA inspections. And I fully expected to see what happened when COVID hit, is that people weren't traveling. So it was very hard to inspect plants, particularly hard to inspect plants in China, in India. And what's concerning to me is that we're nowhere near the levels we were before COVID. So does this cause more shortages when some people taking shortcuts, and when they finally get around to be inspected, does this cause more shortages? So that's a question that I pose. Next slide. Then you had Acorn. Everybody heard of Acorn? The generic manufacturers decided to go out of business overnight. And why that was important, because 86% of the albuterol 5 milligram used in hospitals was made by Acorn. And there was only 2 manufacturers that made it, and both were having FDA inspection difficulties. So my rule of thumb is there ought to be 5, you ought to have at least 5 players in every market. So you don't find yourself in a position like this. Because your normal thing is go to the people, the other person that makes it, if they're having difficulty making it, what good is it? Next slide. Product launches. This little goes to Dr. Stein's and Peter's presentation. There's 50 launches so far this year in 2023. And the next slide will show you in context of what it looks like in the previous couple of years. It is a recovery. We've seen a recent recovery in the number of launches. Go back.
Oh, sorry.
I know you want me to speed up, but I'm trying to go as fast as I can. 30% of them were in immunology, 20% were oncology, and 12% were nervous system. And the biggest one was the RSV vaccine. So I did decide to get the flu vaccine and the RSV vaccine because I had RSV and it was not fun. The next slide shows you how that 2023 number compares. And we were running lower than 2021 in 2022 and up until this point in 2023. The other thing, you can take a look at this and see the brown is the oncology. Generally, we've seen more oncology launches as a percent. The ones that we particularly look for is the launches in Alzheimer's, because that is another untapped space. And we had one from Biogen that didn't quite make it. We have from Eisai one that has potential, and I think there's a Lilly one about ready to come. So that's one I'll be looking for because there's so many unmet needs in that category. Next slide. These have a list of the top 10. For most of the year, Angivita, which was the biosimilar for Humira, was number 1. Now that it's been overtaken by the RSV, but there's not been, the biggest one in 22 was Mounjaro. The biggest one in 2021 was Veklury. We've not had any huge ones like those two. Next slide. This is the chart I promised you on Humira. So you've had looking at the fourth quarter of 2022 to the present, and right up at the top is the generic penetration or the biosimilar penetration in that molecule, which is very small at this point. And some of those are biosimilar, some of those are bioequivalent, some of those are saline or citrus-free, and so forth. This is a very big concern of mine that this is not happening, because this will repeat when we see Stelara. Next slide. Outlook. So we're getting down the home stretch. We see growth in the marketplace. The marketplace is going to be relatively stressed because the net compounded growth continues to decline, because the rebates tend to be bigger. And then I'll just show you a couple cases. The next slide looks at the classes we expect to grow the most, and this is on a net basis. So you see obesity way up there in the far right hand corner. The way to interpret this chart, left to right is the 5-year projection, from bottom to top is a 1-year projection. This is a net basis. See, oncology big, and oncology is big despite the fact there's been 3 biosimilars and big oncology drugs. You see that the diabetes is down here because there's a lot of rebating on diabetes, something like 60 or 70%. So, when and now with the IRA Reduction Act, is a lot of these diabetes insulins are going to be $35. Next slide. So the obesity drugs, we're expecting that to grow. I said $62 billion this year, and I think it's going to be the biggest class in the next year, maybe reaching close to $80 to $100 billion in the next couple of years, which would be, you have a $600 billion marketplace, $100 billion in one category. So that's only going to go up. Next slide is that the diabetes, the gross dollars look better than the net dollars, and we see that there can be 8 to 11% decline in compound annual growth when you look at it on a net basis, despite how fast it's growing. Next one is savings. We've talked about that. We can skip this one. This is autoimmune. We expect there'll be savings on autoimmune on the biosimilars, although it's not quite played out the way that I thought it would. Next slide. So last one. All right, we did that in about 30 minutes. I think. Yep. All right, so GLP-1s, huge impact on sales and RXs. Thing to remember, retail pharmacies lose money on every one they dispense. That's not sustainable. Second one, cough, cold, and flu season. Flu was mild. We don't see that COVID vaccines would be weak. They are weak. Mental health and ADHD drugs have experienced increase in prescribing, and some have had an increase in out of stocks. The biosimilars on Humira have launched. What will be their future impact? You have branded generic and actual unbranded generic compression happening. OTC products, you now have an OTC birth control pill coming out next year called O-pill. See how that impacts the contraceptive market. And you're going to see Narcan, see how that affects that market as well. The non-COVID, non-flu vaccines are recovering slowly. One thing is I would say there's more resistance or reluctance on vaccines than you've seen before, particularly involving pediatrics. Drug shortages, we talked, are significant, particularly in oncology. Medicaid disenrollment, we've had about 10 million people that have left the rolls of Medicaid. They were put on the rolls of Medicaid when COVID hit. Now they're being disenrolled. Where do they go? The good news, they generally are a healthier population and younger. And then what will be the impact of IRA, DSCA, DIR fees on retail pharmacy? I didn't have time to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, but the more that I've talked to people, they call it the Innovation Reduction Act. And I think that will have a dramatic effect. So with that, thank you very much for your kind attention. Be happy to answer any questions you might have.